Please have a welcome to Otto Sharmer.
So the question I want to explore is how to apply the power of mindfulness onto the transformation of the collective. And the first question, of course, is what is the collective? What's the nature of the collective? And what are some of the major issues that we see around the world? And as some of you may know, I spent the past 20 years here at MIT. Basically, I came here to MIT 20 years ago from Europe because I joined the systems thinking and organizational learning group that was founded by Peter Senge and other folks who are like pioneers in that area. And ever since, I have been basically participating in that world of action research applied to organizational change, but also to societal change. And if I look at, as many of you when you come around and look at different countries and issues we are dealing, I think across all countries, we see today a situation that is defined by these three problems that are, so to speak, the top level of the iceberg of the current reality situation. The ecological divide, the social divide, and the spiritual divide. So in other words, the disconnect between self and nature, between self and other, social divide, and then between self and self, the spiritual divide between who I am today and who I could be tomorrow. And when you then, so those are the unintended side effects that we are collectively enacting in the form of environmental destruction and the form of social fragmentation and polarization and so forth. And I know it's not as bad in Northern Europe as it is in other places, but essentially we, across countries, deal with the same issues. I mean, last week I spent in Costa Rica, who, like Sweden, is one of the role models and pioneers in terms of sustainability and a small ecological well-being on a small ecological footprint. But even in Costa Rica, there's a lot of developments not in the right direction, and people feel that a whole new effort is necessary there. So that's kind of the surface level, the three major issues here, and we have responded in throughout history by creating one or two ministries for each, by creating NGOs for each of these issues, and other areas that address these symptoms. But we all know from systems thinking that the real question is, what's the structure underneath that makes us reenacting these issues time and again? And that's like a set of systemic disconnects that I'm not going into detail right now, but to explore, but that I'm sure Lorenzo and others already in part covered earlier today, and you all are already dealing with in many aspects of your professional and personal life. So let me now, so it deals with the disconnect between finite resources and infinite growth, the disconnect between the financial and the real economy, between GDP and well-being, and so on and so forth. But let me, rather than diving into these systemic disconnects, ask the bigger question here, which is, what is really underneath? What is kind of driving? What's the root cause that makes us reenacting all these disconnects and all these kind of unintended outcomes on the top level that I indicated before? And in my view, the most important root cause originates right between our ears. It originates in our quality of attention and thinking. In particular, in the quality of our economic thought and the paradigms, the mostly outdated paradigms of our economic thought. And that's, of course, where, when you go more into that, where I tend to lose my audience. So I would like to ask your patience for stay with me just kind of 3 or 4 more minutes on that topic to go over 300 or 400 years of economic history and history of economic thought. That will basically cover the modern economy. And if you look at the modern economy, what makes the modern economy effective? It's division of labor. It's kind of the key to productivity. And that comes with the coordination problem. So how do you stitch together the whole that has been divided by division of labor in so many pieces? And basically, throughout history, we have come up with 3 responses to that issue. The first one is this one. It's basically centralization. So through hierarchy and control, a state-centric economy that we saw in Europe during mercantilism, but also later on during socialism, kind of the central planning economies, which are great for some infrastructure stability reasons, but which are not so great when it comes to the lack of entrepreneurial dynamism, which leads us into the 2.0 economy, to the rise of the second sector, the private sector, the rise of kind of entrepreneurs and entrepreneurial initiative, and the rise of a second coordination mechanism, which is not centralized control, but it's a decentralized coordination mechanism, market and competition that allowed us to create an enormous amount of wealth and an enormous amount of course, problems, externalities in the form of environmental and social issues, which then directly leads to the rise of the third sector, the social sector, basically people organizing themselves around these issue areas and thereby evolving the legislative framework in a way that makes it more workable with these externalities. So it's now we have the three sectors of modern society, and this has led to a whole set of institutional innovations from social security, Federal Reserve System, standards for labor and the environment, and so on and so forth, that has led to an economy that in Europe we call the social market economy. Here in America, we call it kind of stakeholder capitalism, but it's basically the three sectors, interacting and organized interest groups dealing with each other in order to evolve the legislative framework. That has worked okay for the better part of the 20th century. For many people within the OECD countries, not necessarily outside of that, but today, at the beginning of the 21st century, we are hitting the wall because this system cannot deal with the global externalities that we are facing today. And I see the current crisis that we face globally as a transition phase to something that might evolve as a 4.0 economy, a co-creative economy in which the three sectors are no longer like in the 3.0 economy working against each other, but working with each other in order to co-create innovations at the scale of the whole system. In order to innovate, create innovations that really evolve how the entire system is operating. So let me step back and summarize what I just said. What I basically said is that the history of the modern economy and the history of modern economic thought can be seen as the evolution, the embodiment of an evolving human consciousness that works from traditional awareness, like 1.0, fitting into existing traditions and norms, like loyalty and so forth, to what's, the 2.0 world that you could say is, ecosystem awareness that we still teach today at business schools like the one I'm teaching, sitting in here right now. and the 3.0 stakeholder awareness, which is what's really going on. So if you're a leader, if you're a manager in a company, in an NGO, in a governmental agency, that's what you need to do. You need to develop these various stakeholder relationships that you have and be effective there. So it's already evolved from the ecosystem awareness that, maybe neoclassic economic theory is suggesting. But what we believe, many of us, I think, today, is that we need to move on to something that could be called ecosystem awareness, by which I mean an awareness that is focusing on the well-being of all, not just some of the stakeholders, but all of the stakeholders, in particular, the ones that are most marginalized. And that's basically what I believe is the number one leadership challenge today in the world. So what is the number one leadership challenge today? When you go to any institution or any company, any government today, what do you see? You see that leaders face challenges that, by and large, they cannot solve alone. No one can do it alone. Not only not with your own company, but you also cannot do it alone with your own sector, just companies. We need to pull together, usually, in order to address the big issues today, stakeholder systems that include partners from business, government, and civil society. Think about sustainable mobility, think about energy. It's all the same, basically. You need to pull together these stakeholders. And then, once you did, you need to move them from an old way of operating, where they just operate from their silo perspective or ecosystem awareness, to a new way of operating, where they operate from an extended awareness that is focusing on the well-being of all, something I call ecosystem awareness. So it's that ecosystem awareness to ecosystem awareness shift that I believe is really the number one leadership challenge today. And how do you do that? So how do you do that? And, that's really what I have been focusing on the past 10, 15 years in practical experiments. And what we learned is this, that what it takes is a journey that's moving that stakeholder group through the stages of moving beyond your old patterns of downloading, your habitual habits of action and thought, and then to observe the system from the edges, to observe how the system works through the eyes of all the other stakeholders, particularly the most marginalized. And then move on from there into deep reflection spaces where you kind of make sense of everything that you learned in the observe, but then also connect that to your deeper sources of knowing, of, the deeper intention that underlies your own journey individually and collectively. And then when a spark or a two shows up, act in an instant, explore these new ideas through rapid cycle prototyping initiative, where you do something very quickly, very locally, very inexpensively, that puts you on a path of learning by doing. That's the first thing that I basically learned. That in order to, in the moment of disruption we are in, when you deal with disruptive innovation challenges, that you need to engage with, you need to activate a deeper learning and innovation cycle that, by and large is going through these stages. But the other thing that I learned is this: for this process to work, it takes some new, in order for this to work, it takes some inner leadership work that we are, that we need to engage with, that basically deal with the opening of the mind, the heart, and the will. And what I mean with the opening of the mind is the capacity to suspend your old habits of thought. And what I mean with open heart is the capacity to empathize, to redirect your attention from your own angle to seeing the situation through the eyes of another. And what I mean with open will is basically the capacity to letting go and letting come. So that's basically the second thing that I learned. So it's not only this process, it's some inner leadership work that we need to engage with. And essentially, it's this inner leadership work that helps us to deal with what I believe are the three main obstacles why we don't see more of profound innovation in society today that, keeps us back in the old habits of action and thought. And that has to do with these three enemies, when I say enemies, I'm of course speaking to you as an American. If I would articulate that in a more European way, I would say three sources of resistance, right? Which are the voice of judgment, the voice of cynicism, and the voice of fear. So why are these sources of resistance? Because the voice of judgment is basically blocking the opening process of the mind, which is why in creativity techniques, that's the first rule, that you suspend the voice of judgment. But the same applies to the voice of cynicism and the voice of fear. They basically do the same. They're blocking our opening process to connecting with our deeper sources of knowing. So that's basically, what I learned more on an individual level, but or small group level. But the real question, of course, for many of us today is how do we apply that to the larger systems changes that we see in the world, that we deal with in our organizations, in our communities today. And what we learned is that, to apply the power of mindfulness more on the level of the collective takes a journey that is moving the various stakeholders through these 5 stages, which is basically the 3 stages I mentioned before. But then the co-initiation, which is the first one you see here, is something you do before, and it's basically bringing stakeholders together and uncovering the common intention, really creating some shared ownership and some common intention around what it is that you want to create. Then, so this is a health transformation example here. Then you move into the co-sensing, the observe, you walk into the shoes of the most marginalized participants and users in the system, you move then into the deep reflection stage, then into the learning by doing. And from there, the prototyping, then you scale those prototypes that have been most successful, that had the biggest impact. And also you keep evolving them, of course, as you scale and sustain them. Now, when you look at this and step back a little bit, yes, in this case, there were significant outcomes, around maternal health and so forth. But even more importantly than these outcomes and metrics, what really changed in the system is how people related to each other, how communication works, how people relate to the system in which they participate. And if you want to summarize this deeper shift, which is really a shift of awareness and a shift of mindset, if you want to summarize that in a single picture, this is what it looks like. The old way of looking at this at the system is this, which is the system is out there, right? So it's like outside of myself. And when you move, when you go through this deeper renewal and innovation process, the way you see the system is morphing to something like this. You begin to see yourself as part of the system, because as long as I see the system like that, it's all the idiots around me that cause the problem. But the moment I see the system in a way that includes myself, that includes the observer, then, of course, we begin to operate in a way where we see the changes, the leverage point of change, how we can change in order to improve the situation. We begin to see how we contribute to the problems that maybe or the challenges that are bothering us. So if you move from this type of awareness, the reality is out there, to this kind of awareness, by bending the beam of observation back onto the observing self, what do we call that? We call that mindfulness. Mindfulness essentially is the capacity to pay attention to your attention. And when this mental procedure, kind of, if you shift the consciousness from this level to this level, on the level of a team, let's say on the level, of conversation, what do we call that? So if a group is going through that, what do we call that? We call that dialogue. Dialogue is not people talking to each other. Dialogue is the capacity of a system to see itself. And as many of you who work in organizations know, moving a group, moving an organization from here to here, that's like 50% of change management, if not more. It's kind of, moving from complaining about others to, seeing how you contribute and how you could contribute better. And that's, of course, also the essence of systems thinking. The essence of systems thinking is making a system sense and see itself, because that's where the leverage for change becomes, is getting into reach. So how do you do that then in larger systems? Kind of you take folks on a journey, kind of you bring kind of all these, diverging and contradicting and conflicting stakeholders together. You take them on a journey. You move them into the trenches, kind of in this case, it's kind of visiting the Bajau people who live on sea in Indonesia. So you kind of experience the system from the edges through the eyes of all the various stakeholders. You use new methodologies to synthesize everything that you learned, into and making visible some of the deeper change dynamics. And you can do that by this process we call 4D mapping. You can do it by using scenario thinking as a methodology. So this is a European example. In fact, kind of one of the most sustainable banks in Europe in a strategy reinvention process. Or you can use some other methodologies, but basically making, leaning into what's changing around you and then making the system see itself. This is yet another process, kind of that a few of us, kind of who are speaking to you today and tomorrow, have been participating in the global well-being and lab. So the last example. So I don't, want to, and you will have other examples yourself. The last example I want to quickly move into is something that maybe is the most interesting in my life so far, and that just started a few months ago. And it deals with the issue that you may be familiar with, which is, when you go through these change processes, including the ones that I mentioned before here, like this one, what's the issue around that? We know transformational change can happen, and it does happen. We all have seen it, but it's very, very high touch, high maintenance, and expensive to create these learning environments. So dealing with the large issues, kind of the challenge of scaling it up and seeing the extent of the challenge that we face today, always comes with the question, how can we ever bring this deep learning methodologies to the level of scale that's necessary today? And in my space, which is that I'm working on, which is education, the major disruption that happens now has to do with, of course, digitization, with MOOCs. MOOCs is an acronym for Massive Open Online Courses. And MIT has been a major, together with other universities, innovator in that, basically making all educational content available for free for everyone. So it's a massive democratization in the access of education, which is great. But then it comes with, the result that at the end, everyone is sitting in front of their computer screen. So education was bad before, we know that. It's worse now with, when everyone in the end only sits in front of their computer screen. So because it's just used for the transfer of technical knowledge in many cases and not for the deeper transformative community change that many of us are dealing with. So can you combine these two things? That was really the question of this experiment called u.lab that we started earlier today. So I want to show you a little clip, which is like an invitation into this experiment. It's a clip that we released a few weeks ago, and then wrap up some of the learnings that we have had around this. We're here at MIT next to a sculpture called the Alchemist, which since its installation in 2011 has quickly become a popular and iconic symbol on campus. Part magician, part scientist, and part philosopher, the alchemist seems to be in contemplation. But at the same time, the structure is open, inviting people to go in. Now, look at the area surrounding the sculpture. You might notice something familiar. The benches are made from the limestone salvaged from the original MIT dome. As you may remember from the last video, the MIT dome was built in 1916. It reflects how universities thought about education at the time. Abstract knowledge at the top and applied knowledge at the bottom. In the new MIT that's emerging now, the dome opens up and the process of learning is moving out into the real world to a more collaborative structure that allows people to connect more freely. You might be surprised that this transformation of learning and leadership has deep roots here at MIT that go back to at least the 1940s. We are now inside the Sloan School of Management. And on this wall, you see the lineage of some path-breaking action researchers here at MIT. Here you see Kurt Lewin, one of the most influential social scientists of the 20th century. He summarized his approach by saying, you cannot understand a system unless you change it. One researcher who picked up Lewin's ideas and developed them further was Ed Schein. When he arrived here at Sloan as a young faculty, he pioneered a new model of learning, one that puts the learner into the driver's seat of change and the educator in the role of coach. Meanwhile, next door, Jay Forrester was creating the field of system dynamics, from which in 1972, the study and book Limits to Growth emerged. While some of Jay Forrester's students were working on the Limits to Growth study, Peter Senge joined the group and became interested in how to link system dynamics with real-world change. It was that integration that drew me here 21 years ago.
Was it a system dynamics class here at MIT?
Since then, Peter and I, together with other colleagues, further developed this approach by exploring the deeper dynamics of social systems from the viewpoint of an evolving human consciousness. What emerged from this line of work is a concept called Theory U. That's the lineage of Kurt Lewin, Ed Schein, Peter Senge. Which brings us back right here to the Alchemist. The inversion of the dome represents a profound transformation that we can observe across all institutions in society today. Governments are opening participatory spaces for citizens and organizations to co-shape the issues that matter to them. Leading global companies are creating spaces for co-creative learning across boundaries. Social entrepreneur and co-working spaces, such as impact hubs, are transforming themselves into spaces for co-sensing and co-shaping the future of their city ecologies. The U.lab has surfaced and co-generated many of these initiatives. As you step inside the alchemist, what do you see? You see a bunch of mathematical formulas. It reminds me of the picture that I kept on my desk for the past 20 plus years, The School of Athens by Raphael. It is said that at the entrance door there was a sentence engraved that said, "Let no one ignorant of math and geometry enter here." Now, 2,400 years later, what should mark the entrance of such a school that we are aspiring to create? That sentence, I believe, should deal with a threshold that we need to cross in order to experience the remaking of the world from within. It could read, "Let no one enter who cannot see that the issues outside are a mirror of the issues inside." The entrance to this university is not in any one place. It exists wherever you are. And that is ultimately what the U.lab is. It's a vehicle to help you catalyze change locally and to connect you with many of us who work towards similar change globally. So join us. The journey through U.lab begins now. So that was the invitation basically that we put out. And what we learned is that there is an enormous amount of openness for engaging with this deeper learning and innovation process, that particularly among the millennial generation, that has led in our case to the formation of hundreds of hubs around the world that you see kind of visually here, and kind of here you have a few pictures: Sichuan, Chengdu in China, Mumbai, Sao Paulo, Impact Hub, Oakland, and so many smaller groups also. But basically, kind of, it felt like kind of the first insight really was that we, through this invitation, it worked like activating a dormant social field or potential for change. The next thing that we learned is that these mostly self-organized groups start to connect with each other, kind of across the city, across the region, and to some degree also across regions. And the third thing that we learned is that there is actually the possibility to engage that global group of change makers, kind of, that included like 28,000 registered participants in the prototype January, February, and now kind of 2 weeks ago, we started the first kind of repeat cycle, started with 42,000 folks from as many countries as so. And there is, in engaging this group as a whole, we, for example, showed them this slide and we say, okay, so you have the 1.0 to 4.0 on the vertical dimension, which is basically the different levels of consciousness. Same old is 1.0, habits, old habits of thought. And then the 4.0 is kind of really co-creating, connecting with what's emerging from the now. And then in the horizontal dimension, you have micro, meso, macro, mundo from left to right, which is really the individual, the group, the organization, the larger system. Where are you on these levels? And spelling this out is something, it's really kind of the main framework of Theory U. It's systems thinking from the viewpoint of an evolving consciousness. So we asked them, what's your current way of operating? And they basically said, so we explained to them, the different levels. And then they basically said, it's the first 3 levels. That's what we usually do. And we asked them, given the challenges you face as an individual, as a team, as an organization, as a larger system, community, what do you need to do? And 90% said, we really need to move to this deeper way of more co-creative way of operating. And then we shared with the group this result, and we said, so you want to do level 4, but what you really do is level 1, 2, 3. Why? What is holding you back? Give us your response in just 2 words. And here's what they said. What's holding us back, they said, as a global group of change makers, is greed, fear, ignorance. Also known, as I learned from Julia and some colleagues from Bhutan, as the 3 poisons in Buddhism. And then towards the end of this kind of 7-week, innovation and renewal journey, the ULab journey, we asked them, all right, so given the emerging future that you feel is possible for you right now, in order to fully bring that into reality, what does it take? And they said, what it really takes is courage. And then we asked them the last question, to do that, to make that really happen, to realize your dream, what's the support you need from others, from people around you? So what support do you really need to make it happen? And here's what they said. The support that we need from others is love, listening, and trust. So if you put these together, what this global group of change makers is really talking about is 3 transformations in the deeper territory of leadership, which is transforming ignorance to inquiry and listening, or opening the mind, transforming greed to love, or opening the heart, and transforming fear to courage, as the 3 deep transformations that really are at the heart of the current threshold that we are facing in terms of our collective leadership. So we asked people at the exit survey, what was it like for you? And 88% said it was either life-changing or eye-opening to them. But when you think about that, how is that possible? Then what it really means is, what made the difference for them is how they self-organized in small, deep listening coaching circles, which really were kind of the place where kind of this transformative change happened. And the global connectivity, for example, through live sessions and my global stillness and mindfulness practices that really connected all these change makers with each other as a single global field, of inspired change, or of change makers that in different contexts really try to do very similar or the same kind of things. In one case, let's say in a few cases, larger change initiatives start to emerge. So, for example, in Scotland, we had 5 or 6 participants in January, February, and now these 6 created an initiative that now includes 1,300 of them across the entire country to create cross-sector innovation platforms, many of them local, some of them on the national level, around sustainability, health, education, all the key issue areas, to really take the country into its highest, into the aspired future that all these change makers from civil society, but also from government and business, want to bring about. So that's an interesting experience that no one could expect, that you can provide like an enabling infrastructure that allows the dormant fields of change that exist today in the world, way more than anyone would have expected, to activate, to wake up, to self-organize, and to link with each other. So let me wrap up. I started with this iceberg model, the 3 divides at the top, and then all the systemic disconnects. And I believe what's the task of our generation really is to not only shift the mindset from ego to eco, as I said before, but then also to create profound innovations on all 8 acupuncture points of systemic acupuncture points in which the current system is broken, including kind of reframing nature from a commodity to ecosystem commons, reframing labor from jobs to entrepreneurship, reframing money and capital from extractive to intentional capital, reframing technology from system-centric to human and ecocentric, reframing leadership from heroic individuals to the collective capacity to co-sense and co-shape our systems, reframing consumption from GDP and consumerism to collaborative conscious consumption and the shared principles of the sharing economy, reframing governance from organizing around hierarchy and competition in organized interest groups to organizing around collective impact and awareness-based action. And lastly, kind of reframing ownership from the current forms of state and private ownership to more commons-based ownership rights that safeguard the interests and the well-being of future generations. Those, in my belief, are the 8 acupuncture points that already that need to be focused on and looked at together as a set of innovations that, just like 100 years ago when we moved from economy 2.0 to 3.0, now will allow us to move from the current way of operating, which is basically economy 3.0, special interest groups driven, to the 4.0 economy, where together across the various sectors, we can innovate at the scale of the whole. So that's a little bit maybe the larger systems issue as part of the conversations that you are going to have. I'm really sorry that I cannot learn more from your experience that you bring into this space. I love going to the Nordic countries. I haven't been in Sweden actually for a while, and I look forward to touch base maybe in some other ways and continue this conversation in other forms. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Otto. It's a big applause to you. And thank you so much. We are very sorry that you cannot be here in person, because I know how inspiring you are, even more inspiring you are when you are here really in person. And we are planning you in for next year at this conference. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful day in Boston. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.